Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I don't know why I thought this hike would be like any other. My name's Alex, and I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the solitude of nature, especially the Texas forests. If you've ever been out there, you'll know how quiet it can get, like the whole world just stops for a second. I can't really explain why, but something about being in the middle of nowhere calms me. I guess it's because in the wilderness there's no one to worry about, no emails to check, no meetings to attend. Just you, the trees, and the sound of your own thoughts. So, one Saturday morning, I decided to take a break from the usual trails and try something new. A quiet, lesser-known path about an hour outside of town. I'd seen the trailhead from the road once before, barely noticeable, just a small sign that said something like Oakwood Trail, with no hint of how far it went or what you'd find there. It wasn't on any of the major hiking apps or maps, so I figured it would be the perfect escape. The kind of hike where you could walk for miles without running into another person. I packed light, just some water, a few granola bars, my jacket, and my phone, though I didn't expect to need it. The day was crisp, but not too cold, the sun barely peeking through the trees above. I made sure to tie my boots tightly in the usual excitement of being out there, the anticipation of discovering a new part of nature. The trail started off easy enough, worn, dirt-packed ground with the occasional rock and fallen branch. The path was narrow, winding, almost like it was tucked away from the rest of the world, like a hidden secret. The forest around me was dense, pine trees, tall oaks, and some underbrush, making it hard to see far beyond a few feet. The air was cool, the scent of wet earth filling my nose. I heard the sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the distant rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I wasn't in any rush. I usually take my time on hikes, letting my mind wander, enjoying the peace. The world felt so distant out there. It was almost like everything I left behind, the noise, the traffic, the constant buzz of life, didn't exist. Just me and the trees. For some reason, I felt like this was the perfect escape. The deeper I went, the more the trail seemed to pull me in, its twists and turns almost hypnotic. The thick canopy of trees overhead filtered out most of the sunlight, leaving patches of light on the ground that looked like old golden coins scattered about. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or the low, distant rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. It was calm, almost meditative, until I came across the backpack. I hadn't seen anyone ahead or behind me for a while, and the sudden sight of the backpack on the trail startled me. It was strange. Normally, if someone left a bag behind, it would be off to the side of the trail, maybe on a rock or tucked under a tree. But this bag was right in the middle of the path, not a few feet to the side, not near the brush, but in the exact center of the trail, as if someone had placed it there intentionally, like a marker or a flag. The bag was dark green, the kind of color that went into the forest floor, and it looked well used. It was a large backpack, maybe the kind you'd take on a longer hiking trip or a camping adventure, the kind that would hold a tent or sleeping bag. There were a few scuff marks on the bottom, some dirt from being placed on the ground, but it didn't look old or abandoned. It looked like it had been dropped recently. I stopped a few feet away, staring at it. The trail ahead was clear, but the backpack didn't make sense. Who leaves a bag like that in the middle of nowhere? And why right in the middle of the trail? No one else had passed me, and it was too quiet to believe someone had simply walked off and forgotten it. I felt a little uneasy, but my curiosity got the best of me. I approached it slowly, my boots crunching on the dirt. There wasn't a sound anywhere, just the eerie silence of the forest, making the situation feel even stranger. My heart rate quickened as I took another step closer. I had no idea why, but I suddenly felt on edge. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, but I couldn't figure out why. I stood there for a moment, watching the bag, as if waiting for it to do something, as if it were alive. Ridiculous, I know, but the thought crossed my mind. The forest was so still, it was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. I crouched down to get a closer look, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the zipper. The sound of the zipper scraping open was too loud in the silence. As I pulled it back, I saw the usual contents: water bottles, a couple of granola bars, a jacket, but something didn't sit right. A phone was tucked under the jacket, partly hidden, like it was purposely concealed. I took it out, not sure why. Maybe I was looking for a clue. Maybe it was just an instinct. The phone was old, the kind that looked like it had been through its fair share of drops and scratches. The screen was cracked and the back was scuffed up, but there was something unsettling about it being in the bag, as if it had been left there for a reason. Maybe someone had been in trouble. Maybe it was dropped on accident. My mind started racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. But before I could think more about it, I heard it, the faintest rustling from the trees to my left. My body stiffened. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the rustling wasn't quite right. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, like someone was moving through the brush, trying to be quiet, but not doing a very good job of it. I slowly stood up, my heart pounding now, and glanced around. The trees were thick, and the mist was beginning to settle in, making the air feel heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I couldn't see anything, just shadows and the eerie quiet of the forest. Then another rustle, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the trail itself, just ahead of me. I spun around, my stomach in knots, but I still couldn't see anyone. I couldn't make out anything beyond the trees and the underbrush. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, like eyes were on me, hidden just beyond my sight. My instincts kicked in, and I knew something wasn't right. I should have left. I should have dropped the phone, grabbed my water, and walked straight back to the car. But something about the bag, about the phone, it was pulling me in. I took a deep breath, tried to steady myself, but my legs were shaking. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, something slammed into me from the side. 1 second, I was standing there, terrified but in control, and the next, I was on the ground, gasping for air. My body collided with the dirt so hard that I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. My head hit the ground, and for a moment, I couldn't even focus. Everything spun, and my breath came in desperate gasps. I tried to move, to get up, but a pair of hands were suddenly on my arms, gripping them tightly. They were strong, too strong. I struggled, but the grip didn't loosen. I managed to twist my body enough to see the face of the person holding me down. The man above me had a rough, weathered look. His face was partly obscured, but I could see his dark, scruffy beard and the deep scar running down his cheek. His eyes were cold, too cold, and the knife in his hand glinted in the faint light. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was frozen in fear. The knife was just there, so close, yet it wasn't threatening. He wasn't threatening me with it. He was just holding it, like it was an afterthought. He spoke quietly, as if we were old friends. "Don't make any noise," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're just going to hand over everything you've got and we'll let you go." I could barely comprehend what was happening. My mind was racing. Robbers in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. But everything about this felt wrong. The backpack, the phone, the way he moved, it was all part of some trap. A plan to lure me in to take my things, maybe worse. I could hear movement behind me now, like footsteps. More people. There were others. I was surrounded, and I realized with a sickening jolt just how much danger I was in. I tried to fight back, to kick out, but the moment I moved, the man above me hissed through his teeth. "Don't move. It'll be worse if you do." The air around me felt thick, like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. These people were no ordinary hikers. They had set this up. They had placed the bag there for a reason. And I had walked straight into their trap. Everything I had been taught about the woods, about safety, about being prepared, it didn't matter now. I was caught in something far worse than I'd ever imagined. I could feel the cold sweat on my forehead as I lay there, struggling to keep calm, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything to get out of this. But I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. These people were professionals. This wasn't some random encounter. This was deliberate. The man who had tackled me, the one holding me down, seemed almost calm, too calm, which made everything that much worse. I could feel the sharp edge of his knife against the ground just inches from my face. He was toying with me, making sure I knew how much control he had over the situation. "I'll say it once," he muttered, his voice colder now. "You hand over your wallet, phone, anything valuable, and we'll let you go. Nice and easy." His tone was eerily calm, but the way his hand tightened on my arm made my stomach drop. I was in a bad position, trapped, and I could see no way out. My eyes darted to the trees, but there was no one in sight. No one to help. I could hear rustling behind me, the unmistakable sound of more people moving through the brush, the other members of the group. I wanted to scream, but I knew better than that. It would only make things worse. My mind raced. How had I not noticed them? They had been following me. They had been waiting. It was a well-coordinated trap, one I never saw coming. I had been so naive. The man holding me down shifted slightly, leaning in closer. I could feel his breath on my ear, hot and sticky. "We don't want trouble, but we'll do what we have to do. You understand?" I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to refuse, to fight back. But I knew that would be futile. There was no way out unless I played it their way. For now, anyway. He grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light of the woods. It was a twisted, unsettling grin, like he was enjoying my fear, savoring it. "Good. You know your place. Now give me your stuff." I swallowed hard and, with trembling hands, reached into my jacket pocket. My wallet. I pulled it out slowly, my fingers barely able to grip the leather as the fear gnawed at me. I handed it over. The man snatched it out of my hand, inspecting it briefly before shoving it into his pocket with a quick, practiced motion. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice cold, almost too calm. I hesitated. My car keys were still tucked inside my jacket. My mind was already working, trying to come up with a plan. I wasn't about to give up everything I had. If I was going to survive this, I had to think fast. I couldn't let myself become just another victim, just another statistic lost to the woods. Taking a shaky breath, I glanced up at him, trying to read his face, looking for any sign of weakness, any crack in his control. But he was unreadable. His expression flat, as if I were just another inconvenience. There was no way out of this, not through force. But maybe if I did what he asked, I could get away. "Take my bag," I said, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to sound calm. "I don't have anything else." For a moment, he just stared at me. I held my breath, trying to steady myself, hoping I wasn't about to make the situation worse. Finally, he nodded slowly, as if considering my words carefully. "All right," he said, his voice colder than before. "Now stand up and walk forward. Don't look back." The moment the man above me moved off of me, I didn't think twice. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. My body acted on pure instinct, and I sprang to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest as my legs pumped hard beneath me. I ran. The sound of my boots slapping the dirt echoed through the woods. My breath ragged in my throat, but I pushed myself harder. The fear weighed heavy on me, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close to freedom. The trees blurred around me as I weaved through the trail, pushing past branches that seemed to reach for me as if trying to slow me down. My mind was a frenzy, too caught up in the panic to think clearly. I didn't stop, not even when my legs screamed in protest, not even when the sting of the cold air cut through my lungs. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the forest and into a clearing. My chest heaved, the air burning in my lungs, my legs shaking from the effort. The adrenaline was still pumping through me, but I felt like I could barely catch my breath. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself, trying to shake the image of those men from my mind. The sound of my heartbeat thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't risk it. With shaky hands, I fumbled for my keys. They seemed to be slipping out of my grip as I tried to unlock the door to my car. When I finally got it open, I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. I twisted the keys in the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. But the engine roared to life, and with that sound I could breathe again, if only for a moment. I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the trail behind me now a distant memory. The whole ride home, my mind kept replaying everything. The backpack, the phone, the way the men had circled me, the way I had been so close to losing everything. My mind screamed with questions. Who were they? Why had they targeted me? How had they known I would be on that trail? I didn't have the answers. I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing. I'll never take another step into the woods without wondering what lies behind the trees, what lurks in the quiet, waiting for someone like me to come by. And I'll never forget that backpack, lying there in the middle of the trail, the one that nearly cost me everything. I've always been the type of person who loves getting lost in nature. There's something peaceful about being out in the woods, away from everything, the noise, the chaos, the world itself. I don't know if it's the fresh air or just the sheer solitude of it all, but it's always been a comfort. So when I decided to take a solo hike that afternoon, I didn't think much of it. Texas, where I live, has plenty of beautiful parks and wooded trails, and this particular one was one I'd been to several times before. It was nothing too difficult, just a simple loop trail that I like to take for some quiet time. That day, the air was crisp, and I decided to go out later than usual, around 4:30 p.m., thinking the weather would still be comfortable, even though sunset wasn't far off. The park wasn't crowded, so I had the place mostly to myself, which was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car in the lot and set off down the trail, the scent of pine and damp leaves hitting me almost immediately. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trees to sway in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic way. It felt good to be out there, quiet, peaceful, just me and the woods. The trail itself was easy to follow at first. There were familiar markers along the way, tall pines with small red tags on their trunks, guiding me through the winding path. The forest floor was soft and wet from a couple of days of rain, and I could feel the squish of the ground beneath my boots with every step. It wasn't muddy, but it had that fresh, earthy smell that reminded me of the kind of place where everything felt alive, even when it was still. I walked for a while, enjoying the time alone. The sound of my footsteps seemed to blend with the distant calls of birds, the occasional rustle of squirrels moving through the underbrush. It was easy to get lost in the rhythm of walking, and before long, I found myself deeper in the woods, far from the entrance. The trail had begun to thin out as I moved forward. The trees were getting taller, the gaps between them smaller, and the path itself less defined. I didn't mind. In fact, I found it kind of exciting. I had a general idea of where I was going. There was a small overlook about a mile into the trail that gave a beautiful view of the valley below. I had always liked stopping there to rest and take in the view, but that day I had no plans to rush. I was enjoying the quiet too much. By the time I reached the overlook, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The view was beautiful as always, the valley stretching out far below me with rolling hills and the occasional glimpse of a distant river snaking its way through the land. I stood there for a while, just taking it all in, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin, watching as the last golden rays of the sun began to fade. I knew it was getting late, and I had a long walk back to my car. But I figured I had at least another 30 minutes of daylight. So I started heading back the way I came, retracing my steps along the trail. That's when I first noticed something strange. The trail was no longer as familiar. The trees on either side of me looked different, and the path seemed to shift with each step I took. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe the changing light was throwing me off, or perhaps I hadn't paid as much attention to the trail markers as I thought I had. But after walking for a while, it became clear that something was wrong. The path didn't look like it had before. The trees were denser now, their branches twisted together like fingers trying to grab at the sky. The forest felt darker, even though it was still daylight. The air seemed thicker, as if the trees were pressing in on me, and the usual sounds of birds and animals had faded. All I could hear now was the faint rustle of leaves beneath my boots and my own breathing, which had started to quicken. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that I had just wandered a little off course and needed to get back on track. But the more I walked, the more I realized that the trail markers weren't showing up. I couldn't find the red tags on the trees, the signs that would guide me back to where I started. I looked around, trying to spot something familiar, but all I saw were trees and brush, each one looking like the last. It was like the forest was a maze, and the more I tried to navigate it, the more it shifted. I stopped and tried to calm myself down. Okay, no need to panic, I whispered to myself. You've been out here before. You know what you're doing. Just find a landmark, a sign, something. But nothing. The woods were silent now, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I took a deep breath and checked my phone. No service. Of course, I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a signal out here, but in a moment like this, it felt like the worst possible thing. I was alone, and now it felt like I was completely cut off from the world. I kept walking, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do. Every step felt like it was taking me farther from the entrance, and the sun was slipping lower in the sky. It wouldn't be long before it was completely dark. I had to get out of here before that happened. I tried to stay calm, but the deeper I went, the more unsettled I became. The woods around me seemed to stretch on forever. The trail had all but disappeared now, and I was just walking through dense brush and undergrowth trying to find my bearings. My breathing was shallow, and my heart started to race as the silence became more oppressive. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the feeling that something was off. Something was wrong. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. But then it started to get louder, a slow, deliberate shuffle of footsteps. Not the random, sporadic sound of a deer or a rabbit. These steps were controlled, measured. They weren't far from me, and they were moving in the same direction I was. I froze, my body rigid with fear. My first instinct was to stop and listen, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I didn't know what it was, but my gut told me it wasn't something I should be facing alone. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees behind me, but there was nothing. No movement. The rustling sound had stopped. I started walking again, but this time I kept my head down, avoiding looking over my shoulder. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The footsteps weren't just close, they were following me. I could feel the presence behind me, just out of sight. The rustling sound was unmistakable now, heavy footsteps, almost like boots scraping against the dirt. I started walking faster, trying not to panic, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, maybe another hiker who had wandered off the trail, but there was nothing, just trees. And the sound of those footsteps growing louder. I wanted to run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I told myself that if I ran, I'd look like prey, like I was terrified. I had to stay calm. But with every step, the footsteps behind me seemed to follow, getting closer. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a hiker. This wasn't a lost tourist. Whoever it was, they were out there with a purpose. And then I saw him. He was standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. I almost didn't notice him at first. He was wearing ragged clothes, dark, torn jeans, and a dirty jacket, like he had been living out here for who knows how long. His face was hard to make out, but his posture was strange, too still, too deliberate. He wasn't walking toward me, but he was watching me, waiting. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest. I took a step back, then another. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the weight of his eyes on me. I couldn't tell if he was just another lost soul or something worse. I knew I couldn't just stand there. I had to move, fast. I turned and began walking quickly, but I didn't run. I didn't want to seem desperate. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. My thoughts were frantic, too frantic. My ears were ringing, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up. The air was suffocating, thick with tension. Then, out of nowhere, I felt it. A hand grabbed the strap of my backpack. It wasn't a gentle pull. It was a hard, forceful yank, like he meant to drag me into the woods. My body lurched backward, and I almost fell. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The man was right behind me, his face twisted with desperation, his eyes wide and wild. Without thinking, I swung my elbow back as hard as I could, slamming it into his chest. I heard a grunt as he stumbled back, his grip loosening on my backpack. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning with every step. I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't know if he was still chasing me or not. My breath was ragged, my body exhausted, but I pushed on, driven by pure fear. It felt like an eternity before I finally broke out of the woods and into the clearing that led to the parking lot. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, my whole body trembling with adrenaline. I got in and locked the doors, but even then, I didn't feel safe. I didn't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing. I would never come back here again. Never alone. I didn't think anything bad would happen that weekend. My friends and I had been planning it for months, a short camping trip to Texas. It wasn't some big excursion or anything. We weren't looking for any adventure or thrills, just a little RV camping in the woods, away from the city, away from work and stress. I figured we could spend the weekend relaxing, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows around a campfire. The thought of it all seemed so simple. Little did I know, this trip would change everything. Let me start from the beginning. I'm not what you'd call an experienced camper. I've gone out a few times, mostly to places where the setup was easy and the area was well populated. I'm not one for the deep woods or rugged terrain, but this time we decided to take the RV. My friend Jason, who is a bit more of a gearhead than the rest of us, suggested it. It'll be easier, he said, more comfortable. We'll be set up in no time. It sounded good to me. I wasn't much for roughing it either. So we packed up, rented the RV, and drove down to Texas. The drive was long, but we were in high spirits. We joked, played music, and stopped for food along the way. We didn't think about the fact that we were headed into a secluded part of the state. There were towns nearby, but the campsite itself was far from civilization, nestled deep within a forest. Still, nothing seemed out of the ordinary at the time. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was thick with humidity, that familiar Texas heat that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel a little heavier. The forest around us was dense, pines, oaks, and a few twisted old trees that looked like they had been there for centuries. Their thick trunks were dark and knotted, and their branches seemed to reach out like arms, twisting in strange shapes. The RV park itself was nice enough. The gravel roads were lined with other campers, most of them in their own RVs or tents. There was a small creek nearby, and the sound of running water added to the peaceful atmosphere. It was the kind of place you'd imagine a perfect weekend in the wild would unfold. A few families scattered around, kids playing, and campfires crackling in the distance. We set up the RV and started dinner around the little fire pit we had built. The sun was nearly gone now, and the sky had transformed into a blanket of soft oranges and purples. The air smelled of wood smoke and grilled food. Jason, Tim, Sarah, and I sat around the fire, eating hot dogs and laughing. We were in good spirits, and the woods around us seemed like nothing more than a scenic backdrop to our fun. But there was something in the air that night, something I couldn't quite place. It was subtle, a quiet feeling that crept into my mind and settled there without me even realizing it. The longer we sat around the fire, the more I felt it. A sense of being watched, of being not alone, even though there was no reason to feel that way. The sound of crickets and distant birds filled the night, but every now and then there was an odd hollow silence that would take over the forest. Still, I ignored it. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Just my imagination. After dinner, I felt the need to stretch my legs. I wasn't really tired, but the weight of the day was starting to settle into my bones. I decided to take a walk down one of the trails near the campgrounds. It was a narrow path through the forest, the kind of place where the trees are so close together that the light barely makes it through to the forest floor. It was the perfect kind of walk to clear my head, away from the laughter and the chatter of the others. I told my friends I'd be back in an hour or so, maybe longer if I got lost. They teased me about not getting too far out, but they didn't seem concerned. It was a well-known trail, and the forest wasn't exactly a dense wilderness. At least, that's what I told myself. The air felt different once I left the campsite behind. The humidity seemed thicker, like the trees were holding the moisture in. The path was quiet, except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the faint sound of leaves rustling in the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The sounds of the world outside the forest faded away, and all I could hear was the soft crunch of the earth beneath my boots. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was going. The path twisted and turned, curving between the trunks of massive trees. Everything felt ordinary at first, until I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There up ahead was a large tree. It stood alone, its bark rough and knotted. But what caught my attention were the deep, jagged scratch marks carved into it. The tree's surface was torn up, large gouges running from the base to about halfway up the trunk. The scratches were so deep they seemed to sink into the wood, leaving visible grooves that almost looked fresh. I know that sounds strange, but that's how it felt, like these marks hadn't been there long. I stared at the tree for a moment, trying to make sense of it. It was odd. Sure, animals can leave scratches on trees. Deer and bears sometimes mark trees with their antlers or claws, but these marks, they weren't like anything I'd ever seen. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly became very aware of how quiet the forest had become. Everything was still, too still. I took a few cautious steps closer, trying to see if I could figure out what might have caused these marks. As I inspected the tree more closely, I noticed something even stranger. The scratches weren't just on the lower part of the trunk. They stretched high up into the branches. But here's the thing. There was no sign of what could have made them. No animal prints in the dirt around the tree. No broken branches above. It was like whatever had made those marks had just disappeared. I stepped back from the tree, my heart beating faster now. I couldn't explain what I was seeing, and that terrified me. My mind began to race, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Was it some kind of animal? A bear? No. This wasn't right. The scratches didn't fit with anything I knew. I looked around, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping up my spine. But something felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, an overwhelming, oppressive feeling. I took one last look at the tree before I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking. Not far from where I stood. I froze. The sound was loud, unmistakable. Something was moving nearby. I couldn't see it, but the sound of it was unmistakable. This wasn't the sound of a deer or a squirrel. This was something bigger, something with weight, with purpose. I stood there for a long moment, listening. My heart was hammering in my chest and my breath felt shallow. Then came the sound again, a heavy crash through the underbrush. It wasn't subtle. It was fast, moving with a speed and strength I couldn't comprehend. Whatever it was large. I didn't think. I turned and bolted down the path, my mind only focusing on getting back to the RV. My footfalls were loud, matching the pounding of my heart. My breaths came in short, sharp gasps. I had no idea what was following me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Every time I glanced behind me, I saw nothing. But I felt it. Something was back there, moving fast, close, always a step behind. The path seemed longer now, the distance back to the RV stretching out farther than I had remembered. The trees on either side of me felt like they were closing in, suffocating the path. The shadows from the trees grew darker, making the trail ahead look like a black hole. And then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl. It sent a wave of pure panic through me. I pushed myself harder, faster, my legs burned, my chest ached, but I couldn't stop. I was almost there. The RV was just ahead, just a few hundred more feet. I had to make it. Then I saw it. From the bushes to my left, something large rushed toward me. It moved so quickly that I barely saw it, a blur of motion, a massive shape. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, but I was frozen. My body was paralyzed with fear. I only snapped out of it when I heard the thud of something massive hitting the ground behind me. The thing was closing in fast. I spun around and sprinted, my legs fueled by pure adrenaline. In that moment, I saw a large rock ahead, an outcropping jutting out from the ground. Without thinking, I veered off the path and scrambled up it, my fingers slipping on the rough surface as I hauled myself up. I didn't stop to look back. I just climbed higher, desperate to get away. I finally reached the top of the rock and collapsed, gasping for breath. From my vantage point, I could see the RV in the distance, the comforting lights shining through the trees, but I didn't dare move. I stayed there, frozen, waiting, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. The growling had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been chasing me was still out there, lurking just beyond the tree line. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to climb back down the rock. I moved slowly, every muscle in my body aching from the fear and the run. My heart was still pounding as I sprinted back to the RV. When I finally made it inside, I didn't say a word to my friends. They asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I was too shaken to explain what had happened. They probably just thought I had spooked myself. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen, whatever had chased me, was still out there. And to this day, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just some wild animal. Maybe I was just scared. But I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted. I'll never forget the sound of something unnatural moving through the woods. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever go back to that place. Not ever again. I'll start by saying that I never thought anything could go wrong when I set out on that fishing trip. In fact, I thought it would be just like any other, a peaceful weekend escape into the woods. But what happened that day changed the way I think about solitude and how quickly things can turn south when you least expect it. My name's Jake, and I've always been someone who enjoys the quiet of nature. If I'm not working, you'll find me on a hiking trail, by a lake, or even camping under the stars. Some people get bored being out there alone, but not me. I feel at peace. It's like nature gets into your bones and makes everything feel right. So, when I decided to spend the weekend fishing at a quiet lake in the middle of the Texas woods, it seemed like a perfect plan. The lake wasn't well known, just a hidden spot I had stumbled upon on a solo trip the year before. It's tucked deep in the woods, far away from any park or regular trail. The only way to get there is by a winding dirt road, potholes and all. That's why I loved it. It's the kind of place that most people don't know about, and the ones who do, well, they probably prefer to keep it to themselves. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and I was up at dawn, packing my truck with my fishing gear, tackle box, and a couple of coolers. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a cool breeze, just enough warmth to feel comfortable. The kind of morning that made you want to take a deep breath and soak in the day. I grabbed a thermos of coffee, threw on my boots, and hit the road. The drive was peaceful, just the sound of tires crunching on gravel and the occasional bird call as I passed through the dense forest. It was about a 2-hour drive, and I was already feeling relaxed by the time I arrived. The lake was just as beautiful as I remembered. It stretched out in front of me like a mirror, reflecting the trees that surrounded it. There wasn't a single soul in sight. Not a car, not a hiker, just solitude. Perfect. I parked my truck in the same spot I had last time, by a small clearing near the water's edge. It was quiet here, peaceful. You could feel the stillness in the air, like the whole place was holding its breath. The trees were tall, dark pine trees, casting long shadows over the ground. The water was calm, and the only sound I could hear was the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. I unloaded my gear, grabbed my rod, and set up by the edge of the lake. There was a rocky outcrop that jutted out into the water, perfect for sitting and casting my line. I felt a little rush of excitement as I baited my hook. There's something about fishing that just puts me at ease. The waiting, the patience, watching the ripples of the water, and listening to the quiet. I settled in, propped myself up on the rocks, and cast my line. It felt good to be here, away from everything. No noise, no interruptions, just me and the lake. I'd been there for about an hour, the sun higher now, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a deer or something, maybe a coyote coming down to drink from the lake. But when I looked closer, I saw a man walking along the shore, coming toward me. At first, I wasn't alarmed. People hike these woods all the time, right? I didn't think much of it, but when he got closer, I started to feel a little odd. There was something about him that didn't sit right. He was tall, maybe in his 30s, wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and boots that looked a little too new for someone who'd been hiking through the woods. He was carrying a fishing rod, slung over his shoulder like he was just out for a casual day of fishing. His face was clean-shaven, and he had this friendly, almost too friendly smile on his face. "Hey there," he called out as he approached. His voice was warm, and his tone sounded like he was genuinely interested in talking. "Beautiful day for fishing, huh?" I waved back, polite, but not in the mood for conversation. "Yeah, it is. Nice day." He smiled even wider, not taking the hint that I was alone for a reason. "I'm Kevin," he said, stopping a few feet from me, still smiling like we were old friends. Jake, I responded. I wasn't really looking to chat, but I figured I'd be polite. Maybe he was a local. Sometimes people out here just want to talk to pass the time. So, what are you fishing for? Kevin asked, stepping a little closer to the rocks where I was sitting. Bass, I answered. They're usually biting this time of year. Oh, cool, he said, nodding like I had just told him the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. He leaned against a tree nearby, but not far enough for my comfort. He was still just a little too close for someone I'd just met in the middle of nowhere. I shrugged it off, trying to focus back on my fishing, but I couldn't help but feel this creeping unease. Kevin wasn't moving on. He was just standing there, watching me, talking about fishing techniques and the best places to fish in the area, like we were having some kind of intimate conversation. Then he made a comment that struck me as odd. You got a cooler with you? He asked. I was about to say no when I noticed him glance down at my backpack, which was sitting on the ground next to me. He didn't look at it like it was a regular bag. No, he looked at it the way someone looks at a prize they want. Something about the way he stared at it, the focus in his eyes, it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't answer immediately. No, just snacks. Kevin nodded, like that made perfect sense, but he didn't seem satisfied with the answer. He lingered there for a while longer, talking about nothing, all the while inching closer to my bag. I didn't know why, but something about the situation felt off. Maybe it was the way he kept looking at my bag. Maybe it was the way he kept taking half steps forward, like he was trying to close the distance without being obvious. But it felt wrong. I wasn't sure why, but I could feel the tension building in the air between us. Something was coming. When he finally asked if he could sit down next to me, I should have said no, but I didn't. I was trying to be polite, trying to not overreact, but every instinct in me screamed that I should be cautious. He wasn't just some random guy looking for a fishing buddy. No, he was something else. Sure, I said, trying to force a smile, but inside I was starting to panic. He sat down beside me, too close for comfort, and immediately started asking about my fishing history, my experiences. As he talked, I kept glancing down at my bag, making sure it was still there, making sure it was still safe. Kevin was looking at it too, but not in a casual way. His gaze was intense, like he was studying it. His hand twitched a little as though he was itching to grab it. Mind if I grab a drink from your cooler? He asked suddenly. I shook my head. No cooler, remember? He chuckled, but there was a sharp edge to it now. It wasn't the warm laugh from earlier. It was colder. Right, he said, and for a second I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark. But before I could think too much about it, he stood up. Actually, he said, his voice suddenly turning more serious, I'm going to take a look at the water over there. You've been fishing for a while, right? Need a break? I nodded, still trying to make sense of the weird vibe I was getting. Sure, no problem. He turned to leave, but then he didn't leave. Without warning, he lunged at me. I didn't even have time to react. 1 second, he was walking away, and the next, he shoved me hard right into the water. I don't know how it happened so quickly. It was like a switch flipped, and the person I thought I was talking to was gone. My body hit the cold water with a sickening splash, and for a moment, everything went dark. The shock of it took my breath away. I felt my chest tighten. I gasped, trying to swim to the surface. When I broke the surface, sputtering, I saw Kevin on the shore. He wasn't trying to help me. He wasn't even looking concerned. No, he was crouched by my backpack, pulling it closer to him, eyes gleaming like he had just won a prize. What the hell, man? I shouted, struggling to stay above the water, my heart pounding. Kevin didn't answer. He just smirked, his eyes cold. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he said, reaching for my stuff. I was still in shock, but I wasn't going to let this guy walk away with my things. He wasn't just some unlucky hiker. No, he was a predator. someone who had planned this whole thing. He'd been talking to me, distracting me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I pulled myself onto a log, gasping for air, but he didn't even flinch. He just stood there, staring at me, like I was nothing. "Please," I said, my voice shaky, "give it back." But he didn't. He just grinned, cold and calculating, and then, without warning, grabbed my bag and bolted. I barely had time to react, still disoriented from the shock of falling into the water. But before I could even process what was happening, he was running away, laughing to himself, a deep, unsettling laugh that echoed through the trees. I watched in horror as he disappeared into the woods. My heart pounded, but my mind couldn't quite catch up to the suddenness of what had just happened. You might be thinking, what's the big deal? But that's the terrifying part. The whole thing started as something so ordinary. Just a quiet day fishing by the lake, but in the blink of an eye, it turned into something darker, something I couldn't have imagined. That experience taught me something I'll never forget, how fragile the line is between calm and chaos. One minute, you're sitting in peace, surrounded by nature's silence, and the next, your whole world is flipped upside down, fighting for your life, for your things, with no warning, no sign that things could change so suddenly. It's a harsh reminder that danger doesn't always show its face right away. Sometimes it hides behind the simplest moments, waiting for the right time to strike. I'm just an ordinary guy, or at least that's how I've always thought of myself. My name's Chris, and I'm in my late 20s. I work as a contractor, doing odd jobs here and there, which gives me a fair amount of freedom. One thing I've always loved is getting away from the noise and stress of the city. It's like I'm not really myself unless I'm out on a trail, miles away from the closest streetlight. I'd been planning a hiking trip for weeks. Nothing too ambitious, just a couple of days out in the wild. I'm not some super experienced outdoorsman. I'm just a guy who enjoys a good walk in the woods and the challenge of a tough trail. I decided to head out to Texas, to a remote area in the western part of the state where I could get some peace and quiet. There's something so freeing about being alone in nature with no one around to bother you. But that peace comes with a price, and that's something I learned the hard way. I had been on the trail all day. The hike had been intense. The Texas wilderness is unforgiving, especially when you're hiking in the summer heat, with only a few small creeks and a couple of shady spots to give you any relief. The sun beat down on me relentlessly, and by the time I finished my trek, I was exhausted. My legs felt like they could barely hold me up anymore. It was around 7 p.m. when I arrived at a small RV park I had read about online. I'd figured I could camp there for the night and rest up. This wasn't some fancy RV resort or even a well-maintained campsite. This was just a rundown piece of land, mostly gravel and dirt, with a few older RVs scattered across it. Some of them looked like they hadn't been moved in years. There was a sort of tired, almost abandoned feeling to the place. But that was fine with me. It was exactly what I was looking for, quiet, remote, and empty. I didn't want to set up my tent. It was too much work, and honestly, I didn't feel like it. The idea of just crawling into my car and sleeping in the back seat sounded perfect. All I needed was a sleeping bag and I could make do. The air was warm, though not hot, and a slight breeze blew through the trees, making everything feel a little less suffocating. I parked the car near the farthest corner of the park, away from the few RVs that were there. It felt more private, like I wouldn't be disturbed. The sun was setting behind a distant hill, casting the sky in a soft orange glow. It was beautiful, peaceful, and yet something felt off. Maybe it was the quiet. There was no chatter, no laughter, no voices. Just the wind rustling through the leaves. I remember rolling the windows down a bit, letting the fresh air mix with the warm breeze. I threw my pack in the front seat and then climbed into the back, unrolling my sleeping bag and settling in. It wasn't until after I lay there in the dark for a while, trying to get comfortable, that I realized how alone I really was. It was a different kind of silence, an empty silence that felt unnatural. I could almost hear the beating of my own heart. It was the kind of place where if something did go wrong, nobody would hear you. That thought made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I just needed to sleep. I didn't know how much time passed before I finally drifted off, but I remember waking up a few times during the night. Each time, the darkness outside felt heavier, and the silence felt even more suffocating. I checked the time on my phone. It was just past midnight. My body was sore, the cramped position on the back seat of the car not helping much, but I wasn't about to get up and wander around. I remember hearing a soft, thudding sound, almost like something heavy being dropped onto the ground. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that while camping, but the sound lingered in my mind, too persistent, too unnatural to ignore. I started feeling that itch in the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're not alone, even though you can't see or hear anyone. The wind rustled the leaves outside again, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, just the faintest sound coming from the direction of the other RVs. But I couldn't be sure. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The quiet weighed on me, thick and dense. I eventually closed my eyes again, trying to force myself back to sleep, but the unease was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. Who could be out there? I don't know how long I had been asleep, but I was suddenly jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of my car door handle being pulled. I froze. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. It was faint, a subtle tugging noise, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear straight through my body. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was the wind, or a branch brushing against the door. But then it came again, the car door handle being yanked, twice in a row, like someone was testing it. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, motionless, listening. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to move, but I couldn't. The fear paralyzed me. There was no sound of footsteps, no other noise to suggest what was going on. It was just the door handle, just that sound echoing in the dead quiet of the night. My mind raced. What if someone was out there? What if they had been watching me all this time? I slowly shifted, carefully reaching for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft shuffle in the gravel. It was unmistakable. The sound of shoes crunching against the dirt. Someone was moving, just outside the car. I tried to stay completely still, my breathing shallow. Every nerve in my body was on fire with panic. I couldn't see a thing through the tinted windows. But then, just as I thought I might lose my mind from the tension, I saw it. A shadow moving outside the driver's side window. It was a person. The man was standing there, close enough that I could almost make out his features in the faint light from the RV park. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured by the hood. But there was something about him that made my stomach drop. A presence. He was there for a reason. He wasn't just passing by. Then, in one swift motion, he raised something, what looked like a large rock, and slammed it against the car window. The glass shattered into a million pieces with a deafening crash. I screamed, pure instinct, and scrambled to get away from the broken window. My heart was pounding in my ears. The rock had struck so hard that the entire window frame had cracked. I could feel the jagged edges of the glass around me. The man didn't seem fazed by the noise. He wasn't startled. He was determined. I knew then that I had to act fast. There was no time to think, no time to waste. The panic in my chest pushed me into action. Without even thinking about it, I reached forward and slammed my hand onto the horn. The deafening noise of the car's horn shattered the silence, and the man froze. For a split second, we both just stood there, caught in the harsh noise. Then, as if the horn had snapped him back into reality, he turned and sprinted away into the darkness. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to turn on the headlights. The car flickered to life, and I pressed the pedal hard, turning the car on its side to face the direction he had run. But by then, he was gone. The headlights swept over the empty space. The dust settled and the wind continued to blow through the trees, as if nothing had happened. I didn't know what to do. I stayed in that car, parked and locked the rest of the night. I couldn't bring myself to step outside. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees. It all felt like it was connected to that man, to the terror I had just experienced. The next morning, the sky was clear and the sun was bright, but the weight of what had happened still hung over me like a dark cloud. I stepped out of the car and looked around. The ground was scattered with shards of glass from the broken window. The RV park was as quiet as ever. The other campers still hadn't come out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I left without saying a word to anyone. There was no one to talk to anyway. No one could have understood. The man had been there, and I was lucky to have gotten away. But I couldn't get the image of him out of my head, the way he moved, the way he stood so close to the car. I never camped there again. But even now, whenever I find myself in a secluded spot, I can't help but look over my shoulder, because I know I wasn't alone that night, and I don't think I ever will be. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.